Hello, everybody. Welcome to week two. Hope everybody's doing well. I apologize for getting the video up today, but as you can see, I'm in the middle of moving. This is my new office, which eventually those boxes will turn into a bookshelf and books. So sorry about getting it up on Tuesday, but hopefully this will still give you guys enough time to do what you need to do. First thing I wanted to say was that I really enjoyed watching all of your introductions. We've got a very diverse and very accomplished group in the class this semester, so that should really provide us with some interesting insights into the discussions that we're going to be looking at. Okay, so this week we're actually moving beyond our introductions, right, and getting into the actual material of the course. And we're starting the course off with probably, what is the most famous work of modern political philosophy, which is Leviathan. One thing I wanted to say was that make sure that you're referencing the syllabus because we're obviously not reading the entire book Leviathan. We're only reading selections because we just don't have the time. So make sure you're checking the syllabus to see what sections of Leviathan you're supposed to read, right? So for instance, this week it's chapter 13. So just make sure you're referencing the syllabus and not actually getting confused about, well, should I be reading the entire book of Leviathan? I can't do that in a week, etc. Right? So just check that out. But this week it's week 13. And I have also posted the readings. If you go on the Canvas page, if you go under Files, you'll find a folder titled Course Readings. And I have posted the entire text of Leviathan in there. So just make sure that you're reading the selections of that. And this week we're also watching The Walking Dead, right? So if you haven't seen it, it's a pretty intense episode. So I guess that's one thing to say, right? So just make sure you prepare yourself because there's a lot of violence and a lot of disturbing material in a lot of ways, right? But of course, that dovetails exactly with what we're talking about this week with Hobbes, which is not just the state of nature, but of course the state of nature as the state of war, right? And I think it's pretty well captured in The Walking Dead what Hobbes is actually trying to say is man's natural state in the absence of a sovereign government or authority. So yeah, definitely make sure to check that out. I don't want to talk about Leviathan at great length in this video because I want you guys to be able to read it and I want you to, sort of develop your own interpretations of it, and I want to hear what you have to say in the discussions. But I do want to briefly introduce the text of Leviathan and talk a little bit about Thomas Hobbes, his life, and how that might have influenced his political views. So I've posted lecture notes in the modules file that you can go in and you can sort of I'm going to try to follow the lecture notes as much as I can. Sometimes I have a tendency to ramble, but most of the pertinent information that I'm discussing you can find in the lecture notes. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't watch the video and you should just read the lecture notes because there's going to be a lot of stuff that I may embellish on or may decide to go into greater length on in the video. So make sure you're doing both. Make sure you're watching the video and reading the lecture notes. Okay, so let's see. Let's talk about Thomas Hobbes here. Okay, so there are two schools of thought when it comes to judging a thinker's life, right, on a couple of things. One school of thought says it's important to understand where the person's coming from. What's their biography? What's the context of their life that may have influenced their thinkings on particular issues, right? And then there's another school of thought that says that no, you should judge a thinker's ideas based on the ideas themselves and leave the person out of it, right? Because if you know what the person's background was, where they were coming from, it could actually bias your perspective on the issue. And you should just look at the position objectively and judge it just on the merits of its argument, right? And the other school says, well, yeah, that's true, but you also need to think about, what were the contributing factors that led, let's say, Hobbes to develop his view of the state of nature and state of war, and why we need to submit to a sovereign authority, right? So I personally, I guess you should do both, right? But I definitely think that you should consider the biography and where the person is coming from. So with each of these thinkers that we're talking about in the beginning, I'm going to do a little bit of a biographical sketch of that person and why it may have, influenced their philosophy. And in this case, with Hobbes, you'll definitely see that the time that he grew up, or the time that he lived during, definitely played a key role in his understanding of, how man comes to live in a political system, right, into a society. So, and I guess that also brings up the question of, well, why start with Hobbes? So, there's a couple of reasons, and here's sort of my thinking of why we started with Hobbes versus, let's say, starting with Aristotle or starting with Plato, which is a legitimate place to start a course in political theory. One, I think this Hobbes is sort of his Leviathan is the definitive work of modern political theory. All works either respond to Hobbes in some way, or they build upon or refute what Hobbes has said in Leviathan. Right, so it's the most important work of political philosophy since Aristotle, let's say. So there's that, right? But also, I think it provides an interesting way to sort of dive into this material and try to get at some of the questions we're trying to answer, right? So, what is government? Why do we need government? How do we organize government, right? So, I think Hobbes' discussion of the state of nature and the state of war and how that leads into the need for some sort of society or some sort of government makes a lot of sense. Right, and I think it's easily accessible, and I think it's something that we can all sort of wrap our heads around. So I think that and it's starting with a pessimistic view, right? if you watch The Walking Dead, you'll know that Hobbes' view is a pretty pessimistic view of human nature and why we need government. So it's starting pessimistic, and then we're going to sort of run the gamut, right? So we'll start with a more pessimistic view of Hobbes. Slightly more optimistic Locke, much more optimistic Rousseau, right? So, and we'll just sort of see how those things play out. Okay, anyway, enough of the prefatory remarks there. Okay, so Hobbes. Hobbes was a British philosopher, obviously, and he lived during the 17th century. He was his lifespan was from 1588 to 1679, so he lived a long time. So, it's not just the modern era that lived long lives. Hobbes lived a long life, and that's mainly because his job was he served after he graduated from Oxford. He served as a private tutor, right? That's what, usually before the whole professor thing got started, that's what academics did, right? They served as sort of private tutors to wealthy families. And in Hobbes' case, he was a private tutor to the Cavendish family, which is a very famous English family. Most famously, William Cavendish, right, who later became a general in the English Civil War on the losing side, which the Civil War, we'll see, will play a big part throughout Hobbes' life and throughout his work. So he's British. He served as a tutor to the Cavendish family. He was friends with Galileo, right? So during the English Civil War, after a time, he went into exile. And one of the places that he went was Florence, right? And when he was in Florence, he actually became friends with Galileo, which is pretty cool, right? And he was also a regular correspondent with Descartes, who he met when he was in René Descartes, who was, a very famous philosopher, very famous mathematician, the Cartesian coordinate system, right? Those sorts of things. And he wrote a very famous piece of philosophy called the Meditations, where he sort of talked about, that's where I think, therefore I am comes from. So it's a very famous piece of philosophy of mind. And while in Paris, Hobbes met Descartes, and they sort of became regular correspondents, where when Descartes published the Meditations, if you actually read the Meditations, you'll find that one of the responses that's published in the Meditations is a response by Hobbes. So also interesting. And perhaps most importantly with Hobbes and his life, something to know is that he lived during sort of a very tumultuous time in the British Empire, the British monarchy, right? The English state was essentially disintegrating during Hobbes' lifetime, and that eventually led to the English Civil War, which, if you remember your history, it was sort of, the Roundheads and Oliver Cromwell, the parliamentarians, essentially fighting against the royalists, right? The people who were actually protecting the monarchy. And Hobbes was on the side of the monarchy. And, as a patron of Cavendish, right? Somebody receiving patronage from Cavendish, who was very loyal to the crown. So anyway, two important things to know. One, Hobbes lived during a very tumultuous time in the English society, and that he was a supporter of the crown. Okay? So intellectually speaking, the most famous work that Hobbes did, of course, was Leviathan. As I said, it's probably the most famous work of political philosophy since, I don't know, Aristotle's Politics, maybe. Yeah, and that's primarily what Hobbes was known for, was his political philosophy, right? But he was a philosopher, a wide-ranging philosopher, right? So he did works on metaphysics, he did works on epistemology, he did works on ethics, he did works on anatomy. The big thing back in sort of that modern Enlightenment era among philosophers was optics and how does the eye work. And of course, Descartes did something famously on that, and Hobbes did something on that as well. So that was sort of the topic du jour, right? That's the thing that they looked at back in those days, is trying to understand how the eye works. And then he was a famous historian. He's actually the first person. He was a huge fan of the classics, right, of Greek and Roman literature, and he was actually the first person to translate Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War from the ancient Greek into English. So very distinguished even outside of Leviathan. Okay, so let's talk about Leviathan a little bit. So there's a lot going on in Leviathan, obviously, and we can only touch on brief parts in this little video. But primarily, Leviathan was a book that was designed to justify the authority of the state. Why we actually need a sovereign state, right? And I guess I should define what I mean when I say sovereign, right? Sovereign essentially means that it has the legitimate authority to carry out the actions that it sees fit, right? So the idea is that we have ceded our individual authority, our individual agency to the government, right? The government is the legitimate source of power in society, right? And that's why the police can do what they can do. And that's why, the government can go to war on our behalf, right? It's because we have ceded our agency and our authority to them to be the legitimate source of power that represents our interests, right? And that's what we mean when we're talking about sovereignty. Yeah, and how does Hobbes go about justifying the need for sovereignty in a state or society, right? And he does it through the use of a thought experiment, right? And the thought experiment that he uses is the state of nature, right? And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit here. He defines the state of nature as a place of perfectly private judgment, right? So each individual, we're all sort of like little, entities into ourselves out there, right? There's no sort of bonds or connections between us, and we all have legitimate sources of authority, right? And how do we get that, those legitimate sources of authority, right? The way we do it is through something that Hobbes calls the right of nature, right? So Hobbes was he wasn't a moral relativist in the sense that he believed that there was one overriding moral principle, and that was the right of nature. Every human being has this right of nature. And so I have here the limited version of the right of nature is the right to do what one sincerely judges needful for one's preservation, right? So the fundamental right that we have according to Hobbes is the right of self-preservation, right? So, rule number one, protect yourself. You have the legitimate right to protect yourself. And you think, well, okay, well, that's, that makes sense. That's one thing. That seems fairly limited, right? But there are implications, of course, to this right to, you have the right to protect yourself, right? And the implications of that right are that virtually anything might be judged necessary for one's self-preservation, right? So this theoretically limited right of nature in practice becomes an unlimited right to potentially anything. Or Hobbes puts it, you have a right to all things, right? So just based on this one right that you have to protect yourself, you may judge that any means necessary to carry out that particular end to protect yourself, you may need them, right? So you may need, these trees over here to build a fort, right? Or you may need this food over here to survive, right? And of course, other people need food to survive as well, right? And that's how it's this right of nature that gets us into trouble, right? And, often we wonder how Hobbes ends up in this very pessimistic place. And, we'll talk about how he talks about how the state of nature devolves into the Walking Dead or the state of war, right? But he actually builds up that thing in a very rational and logical way, as was the way of the Enlightenment, right? They thought that by applying the scientific method to these problems, you could solve every problem scientifically. So as any good scientist, Hobbes starts with certain assumptions that he makes about certain assumptions he makes about human nature. And, the idea is that if you buy into these premises that he's laying out and these assumptions, then his conclusion is, can't be overcome, right? So here are some of the assumptions that he has regarding human nature. People are sufficiently similar in their mental and physical attributes, and no one is invulnerable, nor can expect to be able to dominate the others, right? So the idea with this is that we're all pretty much equal in capabilities. There's no Superman out there, right? I mean, obviously we're not all, we don't all have the same capabilities, right? I mean, some people are smarter than others, some people are stronger than others, some people are faster than others, some people are, more industrious than others, right? So we're not equal. But what Hobbes is saying is that we're close enough and equal that no person, just by the sheer force of their being, like let's say Superman, for example, can establish authority over the others, right? If Superman wanted to, he could wipe out the entire human race. There's nobody like that. So that's assumption number one. I think we can probably pretty much agree on that. Assumption number two is that people generally shun death, and that the desire to preserve their own lives is very strong in most people. Seems true. People have local affections, right? But Hobbes says their benevolence is limited, right? And that they have a tendency to partiality. Unfortunately, we see that this is true in human nature as well, right? We do care about other people, but generally speaking, the people that we care about are those that are closest to us and we're partial to it, and we don't have universal benevolence to everyone. Right, and this is a point that could be contested, on Hobbes's picture, right? And you see philanthropy and people giving to charities and stuff, and maybe you could, but it's hard to argue that you care just as much for somebody who is starving in Africa, let's say, as if you saw someone starving in front of your house, or certainly if someone were starving in your family or something like that, or a friend, right? Hobbes also said that most people are concerned that others should agree with their high opinion of themselves, and people are sensitive to slights, right? So we all think pretty highly of ourselves. I think that's probably true. People do make evaluative judgments, right? We make ethical judgments, but often use seemingly impersonal terms like good and bad to represent our own personal preferences, right? So generally speaking, what we think is good is just what we like. Right, what works for us, and what's bad is what doesn't work for us. This is a type of, in moral philosophy, this is a type of expressivism, right, where essentially you're just, all that good means is I like this, and all that bad means is I don't like this, right? So that, once again, that's another point that can be contested. And then he says finally that humans are curious about causes of events. We want to know why things happen. We want to know why we're here. And people are also anxious about their futures. And according to Hobbes, these characteristics incline people to adopt religious beliefs or philosophies that try to explain these kinds of things. Right, so those are Hobbes's basic assumptions about human nature. And they're all, I mean, some of them are contestable, but they're all at least arguable, right? I mean, it seems like most of them are probably true, right? So you take these assumptions of human nature, you take the right of nature, right, which you can do whatever you need to do to preserve yourself, and you can interpret whatever you need to do to preserve yourself to give you essentially a right to everything, right? So you take all these things together, and that's what leads Hobbes into this idea that the state of nature is a state of war. Yeah, right. So I have here, these assumptions yield a state of nature potentially fraught with divisive struggle, right? And the right of each to all things, right? So everybody has a right to everything, right? So we all have rights to everything. Invites serious conflict, as you can imagine, right? Going back to the food example, right? I need food, you need food. We both have a right to that food based on our right to survive. And that leads to some serious competition, right? And Hobbes says, this invites serious conflict, especially if there's competition for resources, as there will surely be over at least scarce goods, such as the most desirable lands, right? So who gets to live on the beach? If you're in Sarasota, who's living on that beachfront property? Spouses, pretty important, etc. And that leads Hobbes to his conclusion that the state of nature leads to a state of war, right? And this is probably the most famous quote in Leviathan. This is the thing that you'll hear quoted very often. This is Hobbes's quote about the state of nature and how it leads to the state of war. Hobbes says that in such condition there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently not culture of the earth, no navigation, nor the use of commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man becomes solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Right? So that's life in the state of nature for Hobbes, right? So this is obvious, according to Hobbes, if this is the way that it is when we're left to our own devices, we need to figure out a way to get out of this, right? And that's exactly the picture that's portrayed in The Walking Dead, as you'll see if you haven't watched it already. So what's Hobbes' solution? Right? So Hobbes says that luckily for us, human nature also provides us with the resources to get out of the state of nature. Right? Hobbes says that each of us as a rational being can see that a war of all against all is inimical to the satisfaction of our interests. Right? And so we can agree that peace is a good thing, and therefore also the ways and means of achieving peace are also good. Right, so what Hobbes says is our rational faculties tells us that if we're seeking peace with others, we lay down part of we have to surrender, essentially, our right to all things, right? So we, as individuals, we have this moral right to all things, right? But to get out of the state of nature, we actually have to give up a portion of our individual rights. All right, we can't have it both ways, and that's something you'll see in our society and in debates over and over again. We want all the amenities that are provided by having a government, but we don't want to surrender our rights to do it, right? And Hobbes is saying, look, it doesn't work that way, right? If you want the protection of the state, if you want all these things that go along with having a government, you have to surrender some of your rights. You have to do it, right? And he says we lay down part of our right to all things, and Hobbes does think that there are certain things that we need to keep for ourselves. He says we do that by mutually covenanting to submit to the authority of a sovereign. So think about it this way, right? Think about, let's say, for example, we're out there in the field, all right, and we all have our weapons and our armor and stuff like that, right? What it requires is for all of us to come around, let's say we come around the campfire, right? And we all have our weapons and stuff like that and our authority and our power. And we have to essentially, at the same time, we have to put down all of our weapons. We've got to relinquish our armor. We've got to relinquish our rights to somebody in the middle. Whether it's a group of people or one person, we give all of that to one person. And we say, look, in order for us to be able to work together and live together, we have to have somebody who can arbitrate these legitimate differences that arise between us, between things like property and food and things like that. And we need you to settle the disputes. But we realize that in order for you to settle these disputes, you have to have the power to do so, right? Because if we say, and this is Articles of Confederation or the UN, right? We say that you are the legitimate arbiter of the differences between us, but we don't give them the means to do so, right? We don't give them the authority. We don't give them the power to do so. They can't do it, right? So we have to surrender our power to them to allow them to actually to adjudicate the differences between us. Right, and that's essentially how it works, right? And that's how we come out of the state of nature into a civil society or a government, right? We surrender all of our legitimate authority to somebody else to say, here, please, you decide the differences between us, right? Make sure that you're doing things in a just and fair way, but we give all of our authority to you to do that, right? And that's something important to remember about Hobbes, and on Hobbes's picture, is that Hobbes is not a believer in limited government, right? He believes that the sovereign has absolute authority to decide things the way that they want, right? So once you've surrendered your rights to that absolute authority, that sovereign, in order for them to function in the role that you have given them, in order for them to function, they have to have absolute authority, and they cannot be disobeyed. Right, because the idea is that if they're disobeyed, it's going to be a slippery slope, and it's going to lead to a gradual, going back into the state of nature. Right, so the sovereign has absolute authority. Okay, let's see what else. Obviously, this is just a very quick summary, right? So there's a lot of things I'm not touching on here, but this is just the general overall, right? So a lot of people ask the question, well, this is it's a really cool thought experiment, right? Hobbes has created this interesting thought experiment. Does it actually exist, right? Has it ever been the case that man has actually been in this state of nature? And Hobbes responded in 3 ways. He said, first, sovereigns or states are constantly in the state of nature, the state of war, right? So countries, let's replace sovereigns with countries, right? So the United States is constantly in the state of war with all the other states in the world. So Mexico, Japan, China, et cetera, et cetera. They're all in this state where they all have a legitimate right to everything, and they have to sort of negotiate, who gets what, right? So essentially, that puts all of our countries in a state of war, right? All sovereigns are in a state of war, against a perpetual state of war against one another, and they all do things that they calculate to be in their rational interests, right? So that's that idea that there are no allies in foreign relations, right? There are temporary alliances that are mutually beneficial to both parties, but there are no actual, friends, let's say, right? And that, in international relations, that puts Hobbes into sort of being one of the founders of the real. There's a strain in international relations called realism, and that's essentially what realism means, right? Is that the strong take what they can, right? So it's sort of might makes right kind of things. So that's one place where Hobbes says that the state of nature exists, is between the states themselves and international relations. Another is he points to this notion of the noble savages, right? So we think about the Native Americans before the settlers arrived, the Pilgrims arrived, and they were sort of living in these tribal societies, right? And so that was the state of nature according to Hobbes. And then finally, Hobbes says that, and this is something that he saw personally, when the sovereign governments disintegrate into civil war, right? You also see the state of nature take place, right? And this is what Hobbes was viewing firsthand as he was witnessing the disintegration of the English state and the English Civil War playing out. Is, essentially when all the authorities that have been put into place, like the police, the National Guard, all this infrastructure, all this stuff that's put into place by the government to make society function, when that society starts breaking down, all those utilities start breaking down as well. And when those utilities start breaking down, that's when you see people. Just think about like Hurricane Katrina, maybe as an example, right? What happens during disasters, right? How people start looting and all this sort of stuff. And Hobbes says when the state actually breaks down, it descends once again into the state of nature. So Hobbes says, yeah, these are places where the state of nature does in fact exist, and it's not just theoretical. And if you're a follower of The Walking Dead, you think that you definitely see it in The Walking Dead, right? You see this state of nature and this state of war in The Walking Dead. So if there's ever a zombie apocalypse, we're going to end up in the state of nature, aka the state of war again, right? So for those of you that aren't familiar with The Walking Dead, I just wanted to say a few words about it. It started off as a graphic novel, or a comic book series, I suppose. And eventually it was picked up by AMC and turned into a TV series. It's in its sixth season, so it's a very successful TV show. It constantly receives high ratings from Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic and things like that. The basic premise is, this is taken from the Walking Dead wiki page, an epidemic of apocalyptic proportions has swept the globe. Right, so a virus, let's say, has swept the globe, causing the dead to rise and feed on the living. Right, so that's where we get the zombies thing. Right, essentially, this virus has transformed all the dead into zombies. Right, so based on this happening, in a matter of months, society has crumbled. Right, there is no government, there are no grocery stores, there's no mail, and no cable TV, right? No internet. God, how can we make it without the internet? And in the article, I also linked an article, or I'm sorry, in the PowerPoint, I also linked an article from the National Review that discusses sort of the political philosophy behind The Walking Dead, and the questions that it tries to answer. A lot of the same questions we're trying to answer in this class. So I think it's very apropos to what we're trying to do. The episode that you guys are watching is in this most recent season. It's episode 2 of season 6. So our heroes, right, this little band of heroes that have banded together to try to survive and see if it's possible to live an ethical life in these circumstances and impose some sort of order on the chaos, have ended up in a suburb just outside of Washington, D.C. called Alexandria, where they have walls that protects the society. So they're trying to set up this mock government, mock society, but there are others out there who do not believe that they're entitled to this society, right? Because as Hobbes talks about the right of nature, we all have a right to preserve ourselves. You've got this really nice piece of property. I'm also entitled to that, so I'm going to take it. And how can you stop me, right? So that kind of sets the stage for what's going to happen in season 6, episode 2. Think about some of these questions as you're watching it. If you haven't watched it already, how does this parallel what you've read with Hobbes? Yeah, and it's, as I said, it's graphic, and if people have a problem with it, send me an email, and we can see if we can come up with a different assignment for you. All right, that's it for this week. No quiz this week. There's just a discussion. Watch the video, do the reading, and watch the show. And if you guys have any questions, post them on the course questions page or send me an email. Have a good week.